This is Karen Short, as Graham said, Senior Supervising Attorney for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Good morning to those of you on Central Time or in Alabama. Good afternoon to those of you on Eastern Time or in Georgia. Thank you for joining us for an important discussion about redistricting that is happening right now. I want to thank our panelists who are joining us today to provide an overview of the special sessions in Georgia and Alabama, what we can expect from the sessions, from the maps, how these maps might impact our communities. We'll also talk a bit about the federal legislation being considered right now that could have a big impact on this redistricting cycle. To get us started, I'll hand it off to my SPLC colleague, Senior Staff Attorney, Jack Ginberg. Jack, take it away.
Thank you, Karen. My name is Jack Ginberg. I'm a Senior Staff Attorney for the SPLC. My work here is focused on ensuring that communities in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana, particularly those of color and previously disenfranchised, have access to fairly drawn districts that protect their interests and access to equitable representation and resources. That means working in state houses, courthouses, and being with you here today. The process by which legislators in Georgia and Alabama determine the boundaries of political maps from the congressional level all the way down to the smallest county school board districts is often called redistricting. The political maps decided on in the upcoming special sessions impacts last for a decade, a community's decade-long access to fair and equitable representation and resources. 10 years is most of a child's life before adolescence. The Constitution guarantees everyone in America is represented by political districts that are equal in population number and are not racial gerrymanders. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 requires that majority BIPOC districts be created in certain circumstances. Unfortunately, certain self-interested politicians don't always value transparency and political maps that ensure everyone is represented adequately. Sometimes their maps don't adhere to the requirements in the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act, and other federal laws that govern them. When that happens, states could be sued in federal court by residents, communities, legislators, or even the Department of Justice. Over the past several months, both the Alabama and Georgia legislatures have held so-called public input sessions to ostensibly solicit community input into the redistricting maps, but no data or maps were made available to the public at that time. So there was little opportunity for input. Georgia held the entirety of their sessions prior to the census releasing 2020 data essential to the district drawing process. We are very concerned that the political maps that emerge from these sham processes will break up and dilute the voting strength of communities of color. We have seen similar tactics to dilute the voting strength of people of color repeated over and over in the recent histories of Georgia and Alabama. Often that occurs by packing and cracking voters of color. Voters of color are packed into a few districts with percentages as high as 80% or more. In these packed districts, voters of color are able to elect their preferred candidates, but those candidates win by large margins, and there are fewer voters of color available to vote in other districts. Remaining voters of color are then cracked or spread out, so their numbers are low enough in the other districts that they will not be able to elect their preferred candidates there. The result of packing and cracking is to reduce the voting strength of people of color so that voters of color are not able to elect their candidates of choice as often as they would be able to if drawing districts was done fairly and legally. When communities of color have access to fair and equitable representation, they ultimately are able to secure their fair share of resources and improve schools, rebuild roads, and provide better health care. Between 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and 2013, when the Supreme Court gutted it, only once did Georgia's statewide district maps receive initial approval by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice repeatedly required Georgia to withdraw at least one of its statewide political maps because they diminished the political power of communities of color. Presently, the state of Georgia is being challenged by the Department of Justice in federal court for passing a racially discriminatory anti-voter law, SB 202. The SPLC, along with partners, has also filed litigation in federal court against the state of Georgia on behalf of Black voters, new citizens, religious communities, and people with limited English proficiency. In Alabama, after lengthy legal proceedings, a federal court found in 2017 that 12 of the proposed state legislative districts in Alabama from back in 2010 were racially gerrymandered. The court determined these districts violated the Constitution and VRA and ordered them to be redrawn. Based on the community input processes and the maps released so far by legislators prior to these special legislative sessions, we're concerned that maps breaking communities up and diluting their political power will be enacted again. We need to know why legislators are making districting decisions. Why are they splitting up cities? Why are they splitting up communities of color? We're concerned the enacted maps will not just violate the values of democracy and open government, but violate the Constitution and the Voting Rights Act and embroil the states in costly, years-long, taxpayer-funded legal battles in federal court.
Thank you, Jack. Appreciate those remarks. I'm excited that we have today with us Felicia Scalzetti, who is a redistricting fellow representing the Ordinary People Society and the Alabama Election Protection Network, to talk to us about Felicia's work in Alabama so far during the redistricting process. Felicia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you for having me. Like Karen said, I am one of 4 redistricting fellows for the state of Alabama, and I represent the Ordinary People Society and Alabama Election Protection Network, both of which are dedicated to empowering and educating Alabamians on what this process is, how they can be involved, and how we can affect meaningful change for our communities. Alabama is not doing well. We are a struggling state. We do not need to be. We have amazing resources. We have incredible people. We have great universities. We have everything that you need to be an amazing state, except for a responsive democracy. And redistricting is the foundation of a responsive democracy. My role, as I see it, is educating and empowering communities to advocate for themselves. I don't want to come in and tell people what they should or shouldn't want for their communities. I want them to know what these issues are, what the effects will be for them, and how they can best, choose for themselves what path they want to take. In Alabama, we're really looking at a restoration of power, a restoration of equity for communities. I think often we talk about redistricting in terms of like packing and cracking, which are I use those terms all the time, but they are a bit dehumanizing. We are talking about people. We're talking about real life effects, and we only get a chance at this once every 10 years. I know that's been hammered in multiple times, but I can't help but say it. We only get a chance once every 10 years. So it is vital that our representatives listen to us when we express concerns. And what we saw over the course of the public hearings was, frankly, a disregard for people's opinions. We saw the head of the reapportionment committee, the Senate chair and the House chair, not really seem engaged. They had the lawyer answer all of their questions. And possibly of the greatest note, they didn't hold any hearings after working hours, only one, and that was held in the State House. So we had 28 public hearings, and 27 of them were between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. Some of our biggest cities had their hearings first thing in the morning, 9 a.m., 11 a.m., during weekdays. Think to yourself, what Alabamian is available to drop everything, drive to a community college, figure out what building they're supposed to be in, and then stand up and testify when we don't know what the agenda is for that meeting, and it's occurring at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. It's not accessible. We were promised that the notes and the court reporter notes from each of these hearings would be published online within 2 weeks. It's totally reasonable for a court reporter to need time to put together transcripts, but it has now been 6 weeks, and we have not seen any transcripts. Myself and the other fellows held a series of town halls, a public forum for people to join after these daily sessions because we knew people were not going to be able to access the hearings. And we served as a way to debrief people and to prepare them to give testimony their own for their own communities. And if we were not there, if we had not recorded the sessions, there would be no way for regular Alabamians to access this process. That is fundamentally incorrect. I wish I had a stronger word, but I cannot think of one, because this is just a just fundamentally unfair process. And it's clear that it is not being taken, that communities' interests are not being taken seriously.
Thank you so much, Felicia. I appreciate everything that you've been doing over the past several months, all the ways that you've been working on these issues. Next, we have Dr. Adia Winfrey, founder of Transform Alabama, who's here to talk about her work. Dr. Adia, take it away.
Greetings, everybody. I am Dr. Dia, and I am the founder of Transform Alabama. We are a community mobilization and organization project, really pushing education about various aspects of the political process to the public, and redistricting has given us a great opportunity to do that. I'm based in Talladega County. Members of our team are spread out across the state of Alabama, but what we decided to focus on with redistricting was the county of Talladega, because with the last redistricting process, our county, which had previously just been within State Senate District 11, was divided into 4 Senate districts for one county. And so there was litigation, and in 2017, the lines were redrawn. So now we just had 3 districts, but that was still way too many because we really don't have representation. And interestingly, our state senator, Senator McClendon, is actually the chair of the redistricting committee. So it was just been a very interesting process. Early on, what we did was we found an ally within our state house. And so we definitely started communicating with her early on in the process, just looking for information that we could share with our communities. We also took a stance of wanting people to understand the power of their story and the power of them sharing their experiences, good and bad, with their elected state house and state senate representatives. And so we encourage people to send emails to the court reporter with the stories if they couldn't come on September the 9th. That was our meeting at 9 a.m. And so we encourage people to send stories. We also encourage people to just show up. Like, even if you don't want to speak, there is power in numbers. And so we encourage folks to come out. And then for the individuals who were interested in speaking, we just encourage them to tell their story, whatever that looked like for them. Whether you wanted to talk about where a poll location was, or even just being confused about, which location to go to. And it was really an awesome experience. On the day of, I believe we had like 10 people testify or go on record at the hearing, and it really allowed us, even as a community, to get a better understanding of how these lines affect our day-to-day lives. And so, following the redistricting hearing, some of us who spoke at that meeting decided to continue the conversation within the community and just figure out next steps in this process. And so we got together, we came with our maps, and people came with ideas. And essentially what we walked away with is, again, stressing the importance of keeping our community whole as it relates to how the state Senate lines are drawn. And so we had a meeting again last night with several leaders throughout Talladega County, and just continuing to identify ways that we could make this message about redistricting understandable to the general public, because we definitely understand that even when the maps are decided upon, the fight still continues. So being sure that we keep that message right in the community and getting it to the everyday people who feel like this is something that doesn't affect them, when we all know it definitely does.
Thank you, Dr. Dia, and thank you for emphasizing the critical importance of community input and for people telling their stories and to use an overused phrase, speaking truth to power. Honestly, that's what is happening when people come to these meetings and share their stories and say why it's important to keep communities together. That's exactly what's happening. So thank you. We've been talking a lot about Alabama. We're excited to have Karuna Ramachandran with us here, Director of Strategic Partnerships for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, to talk about some work that's happening in Georgia. So Karuna, please take it away.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here with you all. Again, Karuna Ramachandran, Director of Statewide Partnerships with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. I also wear another hat. I'm the campaign manager with the Georgia Redistricting Alliance, and Advancing Justice Atlanta and SPLC are also members of the Georgia Redistricting Alliance. And so that's sort of where we come together and partner to push for better redistricting processes. GRA actually came together in 2017. And so since then has really been working in the field to educate and bring that knowledge about redistricting. What is it? Why should people care? How does that impact your daily lives? You know, and really, you know, having those conversations with folks. And the primary goal is, you know, we want people of color in Georgia to be at the forefront of redistricting. And of course, we saw with the recent census data release that Georgia is, as we all in state knew, is a majority people of color state now. And so, you know, unfortunately, the interests of communities of color are pushed way back and threatened continuously. We see that with SB 202, and we see how the legislature just callously throws away the voting rights of people of color, primarily Black voters across the state. And so, you know, unfortunately, we are in the state, like in a position where these same individuals have all the power to redraw these maps. And so, of course, we're very concerned that the voting power of communities of color are not going to be considered when drawing these maps. And so, you know, we continue to do the work. As Jack mentioned, over the summer, there was a whole tour, a sham tour of public hearings across the state. And our members were present at every single hearing, giving testimony, asking for a process, asking to see the actual maps, asking for a timeline, criteria. We've sent sign-on letters with hundreds of organizations signing on and providing language that the legislature could use to adopt and have a better process. You know, we've challenged the fact that this entire process has been conducted in English only. And we have you know, a really growing community of new Americans here in state where English is not the primary language. And so that effectively just denies access to a huge percentage of Georgians. And so it was really unfortunate when we saw the guidelines from the joint offices for the special session that essentially incorporated none of the feedback that they received from hundreds of Georgians across the state. And so, you know, we just have to continue doing that field work, and that's exactly what we did. And after the summer, we took a good 3 months along with SPLC. I mean, our partners here in state have been critical to ensuring that we could continue doing that work in the field, specifically having very local and small group conversations about redistricting and community mapping. So really bringing that power to local communities so that they can define where their communities are, what are those issues that their communities are seeing, and how giving them that resource that they can bring and plug into the process. And so we spent months doing that across the state, and many of our GRA partners were at the helm of scheduling those and getting those done. And so we have now this growing base of, Georgians who want to know what's happening with the special session, right? I get asked that question all the time. When, can you tell us how's this going to go? What's the process? Is there going to be a discussion? Is there going to be, are there going to be testimony allowed? What's going on? And unfortunately, we don't have the answers, and the session starts next week. A couple of draft maps have dropped, and so, you would think that there would be some allowance for community to now come in and provide their input on those draft maps. But the reality is I think that our communities are once again going to be shut out of the process. And so we have to continue to push for a better process in Georgia. Even though it feels grim, even though it feels like a losing battle, we have to continue to try and move the needle towards progress. And so one of the ways that we've been really working to do that is on the local level. And GRA, we wrote a local resolution that jurisdictions, counties, school boards, cities could adopt to actually implement a better, transparent and accessible and fair redistricting process. And this week we had a little bit of progress with the cities of Clarkston and in Gwinnett County as well. And so we hope that we can share good news about more and more local jurisdictions doing the right thing and, showing that counter narrative. And it really helps us to dispel the misinformation that's coming out of the legislature and particularly the joint offices that they're doing the right thing. We're great. Look at us. We took all of this public input. We dropped the maps in advance of the session. Look at us. We're great. Well, that's just not true, because functionally what's happening is people are being left out. And at the face of it, it seems that legislators are also being left out, right? Particularly those legislators in the minority party and legislators of color are just completely, blocked from the process, even those who are on the joint redistricting committees. And that's the perception from the outside, right? We have to continue to push and shine a light on the fact that this has and continues to be a sham process. It's nowhere close to the demands, the very, very implementable demands that we've asked. For us, it's continuing to push at that local level, which is so important. Local redistricting impacts our communities' lives in profound ways, and I think that's where we can continue to build power and see meaningful change as well. And the last thing I'll say is that, we have in Georgia seen some changes in procedure with regard to that local redistricting piece. In 2019, the SB 177 was passed that now requires that county commission and school board redistricting must kind of go through the legislative process. And so, again, along with our SPLC partners, we're able to put on a webinar to just explain what that law is. And I think what I really want to highlight is that it was for community members, but also for local elected officials, because many local elected officials in Georgia are unaware of that procedural change and how that might impact their ability to impact their own maps and sort of advocate for their constituents to have good, fair maps. And so that work just continues at the local level as well.
Thank you so much. And as a Georgia resident, I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing to continue to keep fighting. It's not an easy fight, but as you mentioned, the fight continues. So thank you for everything that you're doing in Georgia and elsewhere. We've talked a lot about the challenges that we're facing in Georgia and Alabama, and these are not unique challenges. They're happening in other places. There's some hope that there are solutions on the federal level. This is the first redistricting cycle since 1960 without the protections of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 required states and localities with records of racial discrimination in voting to submit any voting-related change, including a redistricting plan, to the federal government for approval. In 2006, Congress, including Senators Jeff Sessions, Richard Shelby of Alabama, Senators Johnny Isakson and Saxby Chambliss of Georgia, voted overwhelmingly to reauthorize Section 5 for 25 more years. That meant that redistricting plans in Alabama and Georgia would have to be approved by the federal government in 2010, 2020, and 2030. But when the Supreme Court in 2013 gutted the Voting Rights Act that Sessions, Shelby, Chambliss, and Isakson supported in 2006, Alabamians and Georgians, communities of color, lost the federal government as a check to ensure future maps don't discriminate racially and diminish the political power of communities of color. But fortunately, there are two pending pieces of legislation in Congress that, if passed and signed into law by President Biden, would ensure that the redistricting process and the maps that result would be fair for residents and communities of color. So first, the Freedom to Vote Act is a bold, transformative bill that will realize the promise of democracy, eliminate burdens imposed on historically disenfranchised voters, protect voters and elections, and guarantee that congressional districts are drawn to give fair representation for everyone. The Freedom to Vote Act will do this by preventing partisan gerrymandering, modernizing election systems, strengthening protections for communities of color, and requiring transparent processes so we can make our communities whole and deliver what schools and families need for a decade. The kinds of provisions on district drawing and equal, easy access to the ballot are supported by nearly 7 in 10 Americans across ideologies. This is according to polling that we commissioned at SPLC and numerous independent media outlets. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the VRAA, is another key piece of legislation that will restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was lost by a couple of Supreme Court decisions and fulfill the request made to Congress by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County decision in 2013. Restoring the VRA is central to any effort to build a representative democracy in which people of color can elect candidates of their choosing and communities of color have equitable access to representation and resources. So the way that I've heard it described before is the Freedom to Vote Act is like the cure against many of the partisan, opaque, racially discriminatory ills of the current district drawing process occurring in these special legislative sessions. The Voting Rights Advancement Act is like the vaccine against future election changes made by states like Alabama and Georgia with long histories of racial discrimination in voting. So we've done a lot of talking. We would love to take questions. There are some that have been submitted before, some that have been submitted throughout the briefing. Please continue to submit questions that you have. We will add them to the queue. We may not be able to answer all of them, but we will do our best to get to as many as possible. So the first one that I will read is from John Sharp from AL.com. The question is, what should be done in Alabama to produce, in your viewpoints, a fair map given the GOP supermajority status? And I am going to kick that over to Dr. Adia first to give your perspective on that question.
Could you repeat the question again?
Yes. What should be done in Alabama to produce, in your viewpoint, a fairer map given the GOP supermajority status?
And that's the challenge, the GOP supermajority status, because the things that we really need to do to produce a fair map is like in opposition to what that supermajority would want. So at this point, what I'm encouraging, those that are working in this process to do is getting with those individuals who have the access to the software and the data with constructing our own maps, which I know is happening now, and reviewing those maps and just having an alternative, because the thing about it is we know that what that supermajority is going to push is going to be in opposition. At the community meeting we held last night, someone showed us a map. They weren't really sure of the source, so I will say that, but it was supposedly what our state house district may look like with this new map, and the district that is within Talladega County that is majority African American has been whittled down even more. It's just like a small little sliver, and I don't know how they pulled that off, but it's not a good look at all. And so at this point, what we're doing to ensure that the maps are more equitable is getting the public more in tune with the process, because we definitely feel that there's power in the people and power in that public pushback if they know that there's something to push back against.
Thank you. Jack, anything you want to follow up on to that question?
Yes, thank you. So there's still time for Alabama legislators to do the right thing here. Alabama legislators should listen to communities of color and draw lines to give communities of color fair representation. Communities of color should have the opportunity to elect the candidates of their choice in a manner that reflects their growing diversity. And Alabama legislators should not draw maps in secret. They should be transparent about the districting decisions they're making and why they're making them. The stakes here are too high. These maps will affect communities' ability to secure their fair share of resources for the next 10 years. So we hope the legislators will do the right thing, but if they don't, they're going to invite costly years-long litigation.
Thank you so much. I've got a second question here, specifically for Felicia. Have you had a chance to study, and this is from Brian Lyman, have you had a chance to study the proposed legislative maps in Alabama? If so, how would you compare them to the current maps in light of some of the concerns you stated earlier? And do you see any particular districts that may have issues?
Thank you for that question. I have gotten a chance to look at them, thanks to Representative Chris England dropping them on his Twitter feed, which you may note is not a particularly great way to communicate maps to the general public. So I was lucky to see those. However, it has only been 2 days, so unfortunately my analysis is a little bit limited. But my top line reactions is that these new maps have minimal revisions to account for new population growth, but the racist core and intention of these districts remain. The ratios are the same. We still have the same number of districts that are majority Black, that are lean Democrat, that are, again, fundamentally misrepresenting and cracking our communities. What we see in Alabama particularly is this sort of extreme partisanship where our Democratic districts are very, very Democratic, our Republican districts are very, very Republican. And what this does is it essentially makes the primary the real election date. And if you are an elected representative and you only have to win the primary, I mean, think off the top of your head, when was the last time you knew? Well, you probably know, Brian, but the general public probably doesn't know what the Senate, state Senate primary date is. And so whatever number of people that typically show out for that election then becomes the voter base that you are responsive to. That is not how democracy should work. These maps also just, again, demonstrate that when voters do not get the chance to choose their politicians, when we have the system we have now where politicians are choosing their voters, this, again, responsiveness of democracy isn't there. So the majority minority districts that we have in each of these state maps. So in the congressional map, we know that we have one district that is majority Black, and the other 6 are lead Republican and are white. But that ratio remains throughout all of the maps. So in the Senate maps, we see the 8 lean Dem districts are our majority Black districts. In the House, I believe it's now I'm going to fudge this number by accident. Sorry, 28 House seats that lean Dem are our majority minority districts. They're one and the same. And unfortunately, partisan gerrymandering is legal. You can say that I drew this map to disenfranchise Democrats, and that is legal. You can't say I did it to disenfranchise Black voters, but you can hide it. And that's really what we're dealing with here is just this continued setup of maps that are unfair. So we are unable to have elected representatives that truly honor and respect our communities. And then they're the ones who draw the maps, and the cycle continues. And without some sort of outside intervention, that cycle will continue.
Thank you so much, Felicia. As sort of a follow-up to that, Caroline Beck with Alabama Daily News is wondering if anyone has seen egregious examples of communities of interest being split up, particularly with state house and Senate maps. Dr. Adia and Felicia, I think this is primarily for you. I know internally at SPLC, we're still looking at these maps. So wondering if the two of you have thoughts on that.
Unfortunately, I have the benefit of I think seeing the maps over Dr. Adia, but I can tell Dr. Adia that Talladega doesn't look great in the House map. I think the map that you saw last night was the actual one. I'll make sure you get a updated copy so you can see for yourself. But Talladega showed up to the public hearings. They did everything that they were supposed to do. You know, they followed the rules. They had one of the biggest showings, and they said unequivocally that they wanted Talladega kept whole in these maps. And that's not what has happened. They appear to have, I think they fixed it in the Senate map, but the House, again, they have split Talladega.
Thanks for that. And that's, that was a consensus again last night that we're still pushing, definitely with that state Senate district that we want to remain whole. So I went to Chris England's Twitter feed and I'm looking and I'm not feeling good about what I'm seeing. So thank you for that update, Felicia. And again, the fight continues.
There's one other note I want to make about these districts, and it's a little bit in the weeds, so I apologize ahead of time. But as you all may know, we have limited home rule in Alabama. So the way that our counties are split is extremely important. And what the new maps do is exactly what the old maps did, which was split the counties that have committees into many, many pieces. So again, Jefferson County is split 7 ways when we have enough population for 4.7 Senate districts, meaning that 4 Senate districts can be entirely contained within Jefferson County with 1 district going slightly out of bounds. And that makes sense because Hoover, Alabama is actually, that city is half in Jefferson County and half in Shelby. So it actually works out, but that's not what they did. They went outside the county to draw 7 districts. So we now have a county that is majority Democratic, that is at least minority white. I think it's just barely majority minority. And we have 4 Republican representatives that have huge swaths of rural territory that they're bringing in, some all the way out to Pickens County in some cases. And this doesn't just do a disservice to Jefferson County. It doesn't just do a disservice to minority voters. It does a disservice to the rural voters in Pickens County. Dr. Adia, and talking about Talladega, what we don't talk about when we talk about Talladega is South Shelby. South Shelby is Republican. They're white and rural, and they're going to vote Republican, but they also get messed up. They also get disenfranchised by what's happening. You cannot gerrymander in isolation. You can't do it in exclusion. It's going to affect the rest of the map. So if you draw maps to particularly exclude Black voters, you are shooting yourself in the foot. And I told them this in my testimony at the public hearings, and they didn't listen.
Yeah, one thing that's quite interesting to point out, the Freedom to Vote Act in its provisions regarding redistricting, creating a more transparent, a fairer process would help to address the fact that many of these processes occur behind closed doors, occur in ways that, as was pointed out by a colleague of mine just now, someone like Dr. Adia, who is quite involved in this process, and Felicia and people at SPLC, and even Chris England, who is a representative in our state house, didn't even have the maps that he was going to be voting on. Transparency is not even a consideration right now in this process. And something like the Freedom to Vote Act would require transparency. And it's just so important for fairness in this process, to have people who are engaged and who will be impacted. It's not just the politicians who will be impacted, it's all of us. So we have to be included. So just wanted to point that out, how important something like the Freedom to Vote Act and those provisions really are. Okay, I have another question that I want to ask, but I first want to see from Karuna if you have anything that you want to add from Georgia. I know we've been talking a lot about Alabama, and I know that I don't think you have maps yet in Georgia, but is there anything that that y'all are worried about, particularly in Georgia, coming out of this sham process that you're preparing for on these maps?
Yeah, I think the concern is that, similar to the 2011 map, is that the gerrymandering would be very slight, and that it might just push through. And so we see that with we do have a couple of maps that dropped. The lieutenant governor and the chair of the Senate Reapportionment Committee dropped a congressional draft map. And so there's slight changes that were made there with District 6, for example, that kind of pull out some Asian American communities and other people of color and add some white communities in, and it's very slight. And on the face of it, if you're just, of course, without the analysis and the criteria used, you're looking at the map and you might have one perspective, but then when you see some of the analysis, which we're still pulling, it's not very comforting. And so it feels very much like they're following through with their promises to kind of get back CD6, and so that does feel like the motivation behind it. And again, that's difficult because, how do you challenge that partisan gerrymandering at this point? So our concern is that's going to happen. And also in areas outside of Metro Atlanta where community of color populations have grown substantially, and how is that being maneuvered to maintain the majority in Georgia Congress as well?
Thank you so much. So the next question we have is from David Daly. How would you define a majority-minority district? The VRA doesn't give a percentage of BIPOC voting age population. The GOP tends to pack that number very high. Some political science suggests in some southern states the percentage could be 35 to 45%, creating an opportunity to elect with white crossover voting. Every state is different, but do you have a sense of where those numbers should be in Georgia and Alabama to create both racial and partisan equity? I do think there's a legal answer, perhaps. So I'm going to kick it to Jack first to see if he wants to talk about that, but I'm curious if the other panelists want to chime in there as well. Jack?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say that we have to call out efforts to use the Voting Rights Act as an excuse to pack voters into districts with very high numbers of voters of color. This is the packing that I discussed earlier. So this kind of packing is not required by the Voting Rights Act and dilutes the voting strength of people of color. And by doing so, it perverts the Voting Rights Act, turns the focus away from what population of voters of color is necessary to elect their candidates of choice. And that's where the focus should be.
Thank you. Anybody else want to address that answer or that question?
I can definitely crack at it unless Dr. Dia wants to get in here. I know I've been speaking a bit. So as I mentioned earlier, our lean Democratic districts and our Black majority districts are one and the same. I think in a sterile environment, I think when you look at having districts that are 35 to 45%, probably would have more equitable maps overall. However, we don't live in a sterile environment. We don't live in a perfect world. We live in a gerrymandered world. We live in a state that just banned curbside voting, that we do not have voting in advance. So as a general rule, when it comes to Alabama, I think that we are looking at generally, I don't want to work myself into a quarter here, but generally look at over 50% Black voting age population. The other thing you have to take into account is that Alabama has the 5th highest incarceration rate in the world. If we were a country, we'd be the 5th highest incarcerated. And so prison gerrymandering affects us quite uniquely. This does not usually show up in, congressional maps and in, state and house maps, but it does show up in local redistricting quite a bit. So there are unique circumstances in Alabama that I think generally push BVAP higher. It is an ongoing tension between what really represents Alabama. We are 26% Black voting age population. We do not have 26% representatives. We're 40% Dems just by voting patterns. We definitely do not have that kind of representation. And so generally speaking, going below that 50% is likely what we need to reach equity. But given the realities of voter suppression, of racist policies, of incarceration, we just voted to build new mega prisons with the federal relief money that we were given for COVID. We're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to that, unfortunately.
Everything Felicia said, like she summed it up. Like it's hard because of the unique issues plaguing our state. It's hard to put a percentage or a definite number without it being, almost astronomically high and almost impossible to meet. And so we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. And again, which is why we at Transform Alabama are focusing on really shaking up the general public, because another issue that we have here in Alabama is voter apathy and even people just feeling that the system does not work, which it doesn't. I mean, when they see that we are using COVID money to build prisons, it makes people feel disheartened and kind of feel like, what's the point of doing anything? So we're trying to come behind, with a message and just a new movement to engage voters in a new way, because regardless of what the lines look like, we still need people to get to the polls, and our turnout is pretty low in general when it comes to African Americans, even in our districts and counties where we have majority Black turnout, or I'm sorry, majority Black population, voting age population, the turnout is low. And so that's not helping the cause either. So definitely what Felicia said. And I would really encourage as we move forward, finding different ways to continue to raise the issues as it relates to the prison population and how that plays into redistricting and how, that I feel like that's a big issue that is going unspoken, and how the people are being used in numbers, but when it comes to the elected representatives, they are working in opposition to those very people whose numbers they needed to get those seats.
Thank you. Karuna, any thoughts from you on this issue?
I mean, I think just generally we want competitive districts, right? And that's what we need. We must have that in order to hold both parties accountable. We've talked about how Georgia is rapidly diversifying. We have huge populations of new American communities coming in, and quite frankly, both sides of the aisle have completely failed to respond to these communities and develop meaningful relationships with these communities. And so that accountability is not there across people of color groups, right? And so I think that's our big concern, is that even on the minority party side, we would see overly packing of communities of color.
Thank you so much. We have some more questions, but we need to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for their great questions, for their participation. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Felicia, Dr. Dia, Karuna, for joining Jack and me today. Thank you all for gathering with us here today, doing the important work of informing your audiences of this pivotal, intentionally complicated, oftentimes undemocratic process. In the chat are relevant contacts for the panelists and websites of the organizations they represent. Please email the appropriate address being put in the chat now if you didn't have a question answered or have follow-up ones as we move through these special sessions. Any final thoughts from our panelists?
Just as we discussed, the stakes are too high here. We're very concerned with public input process so far, and we're hoping that the legislators do the right thing, and we'll be watching.
We need independent redistricting commissions. Politicians should not be choosing their own voters. And second, everything Karuna said about having competitive districts, because we need responsive democracy, and our communities are not being represented correctly.
I just want to thank everybody for the work that you all are doing. And it's always a pleasure, Felicia, to be on a panel with you. I got my charge for today. So thank you all for the opportunity and for the work that you're doing.
And I'll just say, I think, in Georgia, we're going to see the process happen really quickly with the state map, but there's still a lot of important reporting that needs to happen about the local redistricting here and in Alabama and all the southern states, really. So encourage folks to continue to dig and shine a light on those important stories.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being here. Thank you for covering this issue. And we hope to see all of you again very soon.